Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And tonight we're going to take quite a kind of a deep dive into the American counterculture of the 1960s, really the product of the Vietnam War, and the kind of the crisis that created, and the opportunities that creates particularly for Richard Nixon, but also for the Southern Democrat George Wallace. The reason why I want to talk about this is from time to time I like to look at the relationship between popular culture and the big historical transitions of the 20th century. And there are few better places than to look at the kind of the cultural and social climate of late 1960s America, where the twin factors of the counterculture and the civil rights movement had created a sort of a climate of social radicalism that was becoming increasingly entrenched. It wasn't simply it was moving beyond the kind of the radical fringes you often find in societies, and finding its place as being much more established in society. And so this is what I want to talk about tonight, and I'm looking at it through the medium of the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young song Ohio, which was the kind of the lament and the anger towards the Kent State shooting of 1970, where students at Kent State University, Ohio, were shot dead protesting against the Vietnam War. I want to talk about this because I'm reading again. We've dived into this book once or twice before. 33 Revolutions per Minute, Dorian Lynskey, his history of protest songs. And this chapter begins in 1970. And he writes, one day in the middle of May 1970, Neil Young was hanging out at the house of his road manager Leo Makota in Pescadero, California, when David Crosby, his bandmate in Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, handed him a copy of Life magazine. It contained a vivid account and shocking photographs of the killing of 4 students by the Ohio National Guard during an anti-war demonstration at Kent State University on the 4th of May. Sitting outside on Makota's sunlit porch, Young took a guitar proffered by Crosby and in short order wrote a song about the killings, Ohio. I remember getting to the nuts at the end of the song. I was so moved, Crosby told Young's biographer Jimmy McDonough. The hair was standing up on my arms. I was freaked out because I felt it so strongly, screaming, why? Crosby phoned Graham Nash, who was working on songs with Stephen Stills at the record plant in Los Angeles, and instructed him to book a studio session right away. He and Young flew down to LA and recorded the song live in just a few takes. At the end, according to Young, Crosby was in tears. Needing a B-side, the quartet sat down in 4 chairs, knee to knee, and sang an a cappella version of their regular set closer about casualties in Vietnam, Finding the Cost of Freedom. They gave the tracks to Atlantic Records boss Ahmet Ertegun, who rushed the single into production and had it on the streets within days, wrapped in a sleeve which reprinted the section of the Bill of Rights that guarantees free assembly. Of course, this was the right that was taken away from the students who were shot dead by National Guardsmen, and the students that weren't, in fact. They were dispersed violently on campus. Ohio, writes Dorian Lynskey, is perhaps the most powerful topical song ever recorded. Moving, memorable, and perfectly timed. I'll put a link, by the way, to Ohio in the blurb for this podcast, because it's a great track and really captures that moment of disbelief, bewilderment, and rage. But it turned out to signify the end of the era of protest songwriting, which had begun with the folk revival, rather than a thrilling rebirth. There were several reasons for this, some artistic, others personal, but one major factor was the direction in which America was moving. So, what we see in the late 1960s is this era of reaction and fragmentation. The earlier days of the civil rights movement, so the standard historiography goes, and that can be disputed a little bit, was one of optimism, you could argue. It really depends who one is. For many white Americans, the fact that the civil rights movement was largely non-violent, and that civil rights that cost white Americans relatively little, and helped to absolve the guilty conscience of white America. It all seemed kind of rather like a win-win. There was the Kennedy years, which, for reasons best known to Kennedy's biographers, seemed to spark moments of optimism. But with hindsight, Kennedy was a highly overrated president, a man who accomplished very, very little, and who seemed to be largely a figure who thrived on rhetoric rather than achievement. But the 1960s that is kind of popularised this age of kind of progression, which I believe is largely illusory, certainly had begun to grind to a halt by the late 1960s. The boom eras of the 60s was slowing down, and the Vietnam War was by 67, 68, 69 placing huge social and political burdens on American society, not to mention its economic costs for America. The progressive left found itself, but after 1968, beginning to fragment and to do what the left around the world will invariably do, and become ever more factional, with infighting and accusations of political or perhaps revolutionary impurity. And the right began to sense that there was a backlash emerging across America to the counterculture, and the figure on the right that centered this most successfully was, of course, Richard Nixon. So the dream of the 60s, which was always a kind of a diffuse and nebulous dream, began to form into a kind of a fragmented and disunited America by 1969. Of course, there are social tensions in all societies, but at certain points in given societies, those become really very, very pronounced, and they were by the end of the 1960s in America. The optimism and sense of unified purpose that had sustained the music of the civil rights movement was dying, writes Dorian Linsky. In its place, violence and factionalism on the left, backlash on the right. By May 1970, the country appeared to be breaking apart at a speed so terrifying that it left songwriters, among others, confounded. Phil Ochs closed his ironically titled Greatest Hits album that year with the soul-sick elegy, No More Songs. The drums are in the dawn, he sang, and all the voices are gone, and it seems that there are no more songs. No more songs of that encapsulate the age. No more songs of freedom. No more songs demanding that things get better. So in 1969, the Stooges, Iggy Pop's band, from Ann Arbor in Michigan heralded the end of the decade with a line, "Well, it's 1969, okay, war across the USA." Dorian Linsky writes, "It was only a slight exaggeration. For many Americans it did seem as if the Union was becoming fatally divided. Reading the cultural runes in the aftermath of Chicago a year earlier," of course that's referring to the 1968 Democratic National Convention riots in Chicago. There's a feature film on Netflix at the moment, the trial of the Chicago 7, which gives a kind of a rough version of what happened there. But what it doesn't show is how the chaos that was largely the fault of the police in Chicago, how that kind of played out across the country, and the social attitudes that emerged popularly as a result. Columnist Joe Kraft had been the first to articulate a new concept in US politics: Middle America. Pete Hamill wrote a similar piece for New York Magazine, headlined "The Revolt of the White Lower Middle Class." These were going to be Nixon's people. Reporters who had tasted police nightsticks for themselves in Chicago found to their dismay that many of their readers and viewers sided with Mayor Daley, the Democratic mayor who wanted to batter the hippies off the streets, and who essentially turned Chicago into an armed camp. Disgusted at the sight of long hairs running wild in the streets and singing the praises of Ho Chi Minh, "We were hated," said a key anti-war protester, Todd Gitlin. "We were seen, not inaccurately, as part of a radical ensemble that really wanted to turn a great deal upside down. Most of the country didn't want to have that much turned upside down." This is largely true, I'd say, in most societies, most of the time, that during periods of countercultural politics or radical cultural change or social change, these things are really confined to the margins. The vast majority of people in the 1960s in America were not hippies and would only have encountered hippies by seeing them on the TV. The vast majority lived largely socially conservative lives and would have quite enjoyed the improvement in living standards overall across America during the decade, but were certainly bemused, confused and resentful towards these idiotic troublemakers as far as they saw them. If not slightly suspicious of them, worried by them and wondering, could these people bring down society? Nobody was keener to exploit Middle America's fears and frustrations than Richard Nixon. During the 1968 election campaign, Nixon sought to colonize the middle ground, promising both an honorable end to the war and law and order at home. So taking away America's greatest pain point, but also undoing what many Americans saw as the anarchy of the 1960s. And Nixon talked in terms of crime in various kind of racist dog whistle ways. After the successes of the civil rights movement, it wasn't possible for politicians to weaponize white racism, and it was probably never possible in a presidential race anyway. Perhaps you could do this sort of thing in the South, but what you could do is talk about crime, and white Americans, particularly white Americans in the South, would decode this as the dangers of the black male. And by saying that they were going to be tough on crime, they were going to lock away criminals, they were going to go after these guys, it was a way of signalling to white Americans in the South that a president is going to be there for them. And often there was in the South, in the from the century since the Civil War, a suspicion of anybody in Washington. So Nixon, he offers to deliver these two big pledges to white Americans. This was a huge part of Nixon's Southern strategy. In the event, he beat Hubert Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, by less than 1% of the popular vote. Had the Democratic convention not been such a catastrophe, had disgruntled Peace Plank supporters not deserted Humphrey, had the renegade Democrat George Wallace not siphoned off millions of Southern votes, had the South Vietnamese president not sabotaged President Johnson's peace talks, then Nixon might have lost again, as he had done to Kennedy 8 years earlier. He was not about to risk such a close call a second time. So the counterculture, some of its detractors, some of its critics, actually from the kind of like the centre left of American politics, say it's because of you that we got Nixon in the first place. If you hadn't demonstrated in Chicago and caused absolute anarchy, there wouldn't have been this magnificent gift to the Nixon campaign. But the other figure that's worth kind of talking about here very, very briefly is George Wallace. George Wallace, the Southern Democrat candidate. Wallace was the red in tooth and claw version of Middle America. He pitched himself as a radical conservative who cried, "I want you for the Wallace Rebellion," and had the lyrics to Battle Hymn of the Republic rewritten as his campaign theme. He stands up for law and order, the policeman on the beat. He'll make it safe to once again walk safely in the street. He liked nothing better than a showdown with the hippies. At his final election rally in New York, he announced, "We ought to turn this country over to the police for 2 or 3 years and everything would be all right." While outside, anti-war demonstrators helped his case by burning Confederate flags and scuffling with officers. Wallace's campaign collapsed after his running mate, Curtis LeMay, of the carpet bombing of Japan fame, publicly admitted that he would be prepared to nuke Hanoi. So there you go, for somebody who's a leopard whose spots were not changing particularly. But by then he had demonstrated the usefulness of the politics of polarization. Nixon's team devoted a great deal of energy to wooing disgruntled Southerners away from Wallace. So Wallace split the Democrats and then handed the difference to Nixon, not intentionally, of course. One strategist commissioned a country ballad. Dick Nixon is a decent man who can bring our country back, only to find that most of the big Nashville stars that he wanted to sing it were in the Wallace camp. Nixon's message to Middle America was Wallace Light. As Phil Ox astutely observed, Nixon got across his image. It's us against them. I mean, no matter what you think of me, I'm a regular, straight American guy, and if you're not going to have me, you're going to have some hairy freak with dope in the streets and the destruction of the country. So take your choice. And that's the game he played very, very well. So Nixon was really, really good at weaponizing these cultural divides, and he was really, really good at articulating the anxieties of ordinary Americans. These were Americans who believed that they were not being heard. They were what Nixon called the silent majority. People who, of course, were heard, and frequently, normally when people have a kind of a considerable amount of social influence and a reasonable amount of wealth and security. And the lower middle classes in America during the 1960s were not anywhere near the kind of the precariat that they are now. These are people who had benefited from the New Deal, from the Great Society, and they had also benefited from powerful trade unions. And they were probably, in many cases, one generation out of being working class poor. So they didn't want to go back down the social ladder, but there was a powerful sense that there was no force in America likely to make that happen, other than the failure of America itself, and these unpatriotic layabouts in their eyes were the people who were going to do that, and the hippie culture just seemed absurd, strange, and alien to them. There were abundant opportunities handed to Nixon to inflame the resentments and the angers and the suspicions and the fears of his base yet further. As the trial of the Chicago 7 had angered Middle America, it had also caused greater radicalization on the student left. Dorian Linsky writes, at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, disillusioned SDS members of the Students for Democratic Society formed a new hardline faction, the Jesse James Gang, which advocated aggressive confrontation politics. Other radical new groups, inspired by the Black Panthers example, sprang up. Among them the Mayday Tribe, the Crazies, the Alice's Restaurant Marxist-Leninist, and the White Panthers. The White Panthers were the brainchild of John Sinclair. John Lennon wrote a famous protest song to appeal for John Sinclair's freedom after he was arrested and given 10 years for possessing 2 marijuana joints. The White Panthers were the brainchild of John Sinclair, having the provocative manager of the Detroit garage rockers, the MC5. Having moved to Detroit to find urban adventure, he was exhilarated by the city's 1967 uprising. According to the MC5's Michael Davis, who attended the riots, we wanted to rewrite society. We wanted to build it up from the ground up, tear everything down and start over, and do it right this time. Sinclair founded the White Panthers in November 1968 with a 10-point program containing the memorable prescription: total assault on the culture by any means necessary, including rock and roll, dope, and fucking in the streets. You can't approach the White Panther Party without a sense of humour, he said later. I mean, on the one hand, we were serious political revolutionaries who wanted to overthrow the government. On the other hand, we were on acid. Even a passing glance at the White Panther Manifesto, which called for the freeing of prisoners, the return of the barter system, and free food, clothes, housing, dope, music, bodies, medical care, everything for free for everybody, would have revealed that acid had the upper hand. For a few months, especially after the Chicago performance, the MC5 seemed to fulfill the counterculture's wildest dreams of rock stars as revolutionaries. I'm so useless. What will happen to me when the revolution comes? Wailed one awestruck spectator. But despite recording the incendiary Kick Out the Jams and the version of John Lee Hooker's song about the 1967 riots, The Motor City is Burning, they fell well short of Sinclair's ambitions, and he turned to his other White Panther proteges, the Up. After he was jailed for pot possession, he wrote an anguished letter to MC5's guitarist Wayne Kramer. You guys wanted to be bigger than the Beatles, and I wanted you to be bigger than Chairman Mao. There is a really interesting chapter, and I'm going to be looking at this soon, in Julia Lovell's International History of Maoism a Global History, on the impact of Maoism and the counterculture in 1960s America. There's not enough time to talk about that now, but this is just the first section of what I'm going to say about Ohio, because there is obviously a lot more to discuss about this period of time. But I think for me the interesting thing is, and I don't believe that the Vietnam War itself fully explains the transition from a society where social conservatism has a profoundly powerful hold to one where there are high-profile instances of people speaking in overtly revolutionary terms. I mean, of course, America has, as we said, the vast majority of people living in America at the time didn't share these views. But the fact that a tiny vocal minority did, were able to project those views, and were able to grab media attention, and were able to shape the discourses on the left, and unfortunately achieved radical reaction on the right, again is one of the really, really fascinating aspects of America in the 1960s, and raises all sorts of questions which we'll continue with next time. Anyway, thanks very much. Do check us out at explaininghistory.org. There is always a few new things going on there each week, and if you can fund the podcast, please do. You can find us via a link to the Patreon on the website, which is again www.explaininghistory.org. Thanks very much. All the best. Bye bye.